What would you do if the man who promised to marry you fell in love with your own sister instead? Cry, beg, disappear. I bought a custom emerald gown that fit every curve of my size 20 body. And I walked into their wedding on the arm of the most feared crime boss in New York City. The look on their faces was priceless. The scandal that followed was, shall we say, unavoidable. The envelope arrived on a Friday afternoon. Heavy cardstock, the color of old ivory. My name, written across the front in looping calligraphy, Mr. and Mrs. Richard Whitmore request the honor of your presence at the marriage of their daughter, Paige Whitmore, to Mr. Grant Sinclair. I read it 3 times before the words stopped rearranging themselves into something that made sense. Grant Sinclair, the man who had slid a 3.5-carat sapphire onto my finger 19 months ago, the man who used to trace circles on my palm and whisper that I was the only ambitious, brilliant, infuriating woman he'd ever want to argue with for the rest of his life. And Paige, my younger sister, the family's shining trophy, a former competitive gymnast turned wellness influencer who photographed her egg white omelets before she photographed anything else in her life. The breakup itself had been an exercise in surgical cruelty. Grant, the senior associate on the fast track to partner at Kessler and Wren, had taken me to the rooftop bar of his building, overlooking the Hudson. I thought we were celebrating the partnership vote. Instead, he handed me a glass of Prosecco. With the calm efficiency of a man closing a merger, dismantled 6 years of my life in under 10 minutes. I need someone who fits the picture. Ivy, he'd said, not quite meeting my eyes. Studying the skyline instead, like it was easier to look at than me. You're a phenomenal strategist. Everyone at the firm respects you. But the partners' wives do triathlons. They wear a size 4 to the holiday gala. You stopped fitting that picture a long time ago. And Paige fits it perfectly. I remember setting my glass down very carefully, because some distant part of my brain understood that if I didn't, I was going to throw it off the roof. You're breaking up with me, I said slowly, because of my dress size. It's not just that, he said, which somehow made it worse. Like there was a whole ranked list of my inadequacies, and my body was simply item 1. It's everything. The image, the optics. I need a partner who elevates my profile. Not one people whisper about behind my back. People whisper about you behind your back because you're insufferable at partner dinners. Grant, not because of me. He didn't even flinch. That was the part that stayed with me longest, not the cruelty itself, but how calm he was delivering it. Like he'd rehearsed the whole conversation in front of a mirror the night before. We had met 6 years earlier. At a fundraiser I'd organized for one of my very first clients, a scrappy non-profit that couldn't afford a real events team. So I'd built the whole gala out of borrowed favors and stubbornness. Grant had been a first-year associate back then. Still hungry. Still funny. Still the kind of man who laughed at my jokes instead of flinching at them. He used to tell people I was the smartest person in every room I walked into. He used to trace circles on my palm during boring dinners with his colleagues and whisper commentary in my ear that made me choke back laughter in front of senior partners. I had believed, with the kind of certainty you only get to feel once before life humbles you, that I had found my person somewhere in the last 2 years. Though, the man I'd fallen for had been quietly replaced by a stranger who cared more about billable hours and partner track optics than anything we'd actually built together. I told myself it was stress. I told myself the version of him I remembered was still in there, buried under deadlines. I made excuses for 6 years. And it turned out I'd been making excuses for a man who was already planning his exit. The truth about the affair came 3 days later. And it wasn't Grant who delivered it. It was my mother. Over tea in my parents' Tribeca loft. Her voice syrupy with a pity that made my skin crawl. "Ivy, sweetheart, to be the bigger person here," she said, patting my hand like I was a spooked horse. "Paige is younger. She's completely smitten. And honestly, Grant needs a wife who photographs well beside him at firm events. You have your career. Let your sister have this one." They expected me to vanish quietly, to curl up in my apartment with a family-size bag of kettle chips and become exactly the sad, invisible caricature they'd always assumed a woman my size was destined to be. I did not go home and cry. I refused, on principle, to give either of them the satisfaction of imagining me curled up in the dark somewhere, mourning a man who'd made it very clear I was no longer worth keeping. I called my best friend, Naomi, from the cab, and she picked up on the second ring like she'd been waiting for the call all week. "Tell me, you're not sitting in your apartment eating your feelings," she said. "I'm not." I said, "I'm about to go drink somewhere with better lighting than my kitchen." "Good. Text me the address. I'll come sit with you." "No," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "I think I need to do this part alone." Naomi was quiet for a second. "Okay. But Ivy, this is not about your body. You know that." "Right. A man who needs a wife shaped a certain way to feel important about himself was never actually in love with you. He was in love with what he thought you'd make him look like." I didn't have an answer for that yet. I just told her I loved her and hung up before my voice could crack. I put on my black silk wrap dress, painted my lips a deep, unapologetic red, and took a cab to the Wellington Hotel. I needed marble floors, overpriced liquor, and strangers who had no idea my life had just been quietly detonated. The hotel bar, called the Amber Room, glowed with low copper light and hushed conversation. I settled into a corner booth and ordered a $34 glass of aged scotch, letting the burn settle somewhere just beneath the ache in my chest. I watched the other patrons for a while, a table of finance bros toasting some deal, an older couple sharing dessert in comfortable silence, a woman about my age laughing into her phone. I wondered what it would feel like to have an ordinary Tuesday again. One that didn't involve replaying the words "you don't fit into that world anymore" on a loop behind my eyes. I thought about all the years I'd spent making myself smaller in rooms like this one, ordering the salad when I wanted the pasta, standing slightly behind Grant in photos, laughing a little quieter at parties so I wouldn't take up too much space. I had spent 6 years shrinking for a man who had been measuring me against a mold I was never going to fit. And somehow I hadn't noticed until the exact night he told me so to my face. "Excuse me, you're taking up a lot of real estate here." I looked up. A man in an ill-fitting suit, clearly some junior banker trying to look important, stood over me with a martini sloshing in his hand. "I need this booth for a client meeting. Why don't you go find a seat at the bar, sweetheart? Or, you know, a treadmill." The words landed exactly where Grant's had landed 3 days earlier, and for one horrible second I couldn't breathe, let alone respond. I opened my mouth. But before I could get a syllable out, the air in the room seemed to drop 15 degrees. "Is there a problem here?" The voice was low and unhurried, threaded with something that made the hair on my arms rise. I turned. The man behind the drunk banker looked like he'd been carved from granite, and then dressed by someone who understood exactly how dangerous he was. Tall, in a perfectly tailored black suit, dark hair combed back, a jaw sharp enough to cut glass, but it was his eyes that stopped my heart black, flat, and locked on the banker like a wolf, sizing up something wounded. I was just asking her to move," the banker stammered, all his bravado gone in an instant. "She was here first," the stranger said softly. He didn't raise his voice once. "And you spoke to her like she was beneath you. Apologize." "Look, man, I don't know who you think." The stranger's hand shot out and closed around the back of the banker's neck. The martini glass shattered against the marble floor. "I won't ask twice," he murmured, leaning in close. "Apologize to the lady, or you'll spend the rest of the month explaining to your firm why you're eating through a straw." I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry." The stranger released him with a look of pure contempt, snapped 2 fingers, and a pair of enormous men in dark suits materialized from nowhere to haul the sobbing banker toward the exit. Then his attention turned to me, and the ice in his eyes melted into something unreadable and intense. "May I sit?" I nodded, because apparently that was the only function my brain had left. "Thank you. I have very little patience for bad manners," he said, signaling the bartender for a second round. "And even less patience when a beautiful woman is made to feel small. I'm Damien." "Ivy?" I managed. "Damian Volkov." The name detonated somewhere behind my ribs half a second later. Anyone who read past the front page of any New York paper knew that name. He wasn't just wealthy. He ran the largest private shipping operation on the eastern seaboard, owned more real estate than half the city council combined, and according to every rumor whispered in every boardroom I'd ever sat in, had more than one judge on speed dial. He was dangerous, lethal, even, and he was looking at me, at every curve of me, like I was something worth studying. Everyone in the city seemed to have a theory about Damien Volkov. Some said his family had built their fortune legitimately in shipping before the darker rumors started catching up. Others swore he'd inherited an empire from a father who'd made the same enemies twice as fast as he'd made money. What no one disputed was that judges ruled in his favor more often than statistics could explain. That entire city blocks had been quietly rezoned in his family's interest, and that the 2 men who'd just dragged a sobbing banker out of a 5-star hotel had done it without a single member of staff so much as blinking. He should have terrified me, in some distant, rational part of my brain. He did, but sitting across from him, watching him listen to me, like my pain actually mattered to him, I felt something I hadn't felt around Grant in longer than I wanted to admit seen. Why is a woman, with this much fire, drinking alone and staring a hole through her whiskey? "Ivy," the Scotch loosened something in my chest, and before I could stop myself, the entire humiliating story spilled out. Grant, my sister, the wedding invitation sitting unopened on my kitchen counter, the words that had been used to describe my body, like it was a design flaw. Damien listened without interrupting once. When I finished, I braced for pity. Instead, a muscle ticked hard in his jaw. "This man," he said quietly, the danger creeping back into his voice, "discarded something extraordinary because he lacks the vision to understand what he had. He traded a masterpiece for a cheap print. I let out a wet, disbelieving laugh. Well, the cheap print is getting married at Ravenswood Estate in 9 days. Damien leaned forward, his gaze pinning mine in place. His thumb brushed a tear from my cheek before I even realized it had fallen. "Ivy," he said, "I have a proposal. I'm not going to sleep with you to get back at my ex." The corner of his mouth twitched, the first almost smile I'd seen from him. I wasn't going to suggest that, though I wouldn't decline it. If it were offered. He sobered instantly. "You are going to that wedding, and you're going to remind every person in that room exactly what they overlooked. But you will not go alone. You'll walk in on my arm, and by the time the night ends, your former fiancé will be on his knees, and your sister will be an afterthought." I should have said no. Every rational part of me screamed that inviting a mafia boss into my family drama was several levels beyond reckless. I said yes, anyway. The 9 days that followed felt like they belonged to someone else's life entirely. Damien didn't make promises. He executed logistics with terrifying precision. On Thursday morning, a matte black Bentley Bentayga idled outside my building. Sergei, Damien's unnervingly calm right hand, handed me a black envelope containing a card with my name embossed on it, and a note in sharp, slanted handwriting. "Buy the armor you need for the war." I didn't go to a department store. I called in a favor from a client I'd once saved from a PR disaster. And by Friday afternoon I was standing on a raised platform in the private fitting room of Marchetti Atelier, a designer famous for dressing women who'd been told for years that fashion wasn't built for bodies like theirs. Naomi came with me to that fitting, mostly to keep me from spiraling. She sat in a velvet chair, sipping champagne the boutique had poured for us, watching the tailor pin fabric around my hips. "So let me get this straight," she said, not for the first time that week. "You're going to your ex-fiancé's wedding, on the arm of a man who reportedly had someone's kneecaps relocated last spring, wearing a dress that costs more than my rent." When you say it like that, it sounds insane. It sounds incredible, is what it sounds like. I just need you to promise me you're doing this for you. Not for revenge. Not for him. For you. I looked at myself in the mirror. Really looked. For what felt like the first time in years, and didn't recognize the sudden steadiness in my own eyes. "I'm doing it because I'm done apologizing for taking up space," I said. "The revenge is just a very satisfying bonus." The dress they built for me was a deep emerald silk that hugged every inch of my size, 20 frame like it had been poured onto me, a plunging neckline, a corseted waist, a slit that climbed high enough to make a statement without apologizing for it. It wasn't a dress meant to hide anything. It was a weapon. On Sunday wedding day, a stylist Damien had sent worked my dark hair into a sweeping vintage wave, while a makeup artist painted my lips the color of dried blood and sharpened my eyes into something lethal. I sat at my vanity for a long moment before the knock came, just staring at the woman in the mirror. She didn't look like someone about to crash her sister's wedding out of spite. She looked like someone who had finally stopped negotiating with her own reflection. I thought about all the mornings I'd stood in front of mirrors just like this one, mentally cataloging everything I needed to fix, hide, or apologize for before I was allowed to leave the house. Tonight there was nothing to fix. There was only a woman in emerald silk who had decided, somewhere in the last 9 days, that she was done being anyone's afterthought. When the knock came at my door, I smoothed the emerald silk down my hips and opened it. Damien stood in the hallway in a black tuxedo, so precisely cut it looked stitched onto him. A dark green pocket square, matching my gown exactly. For a long moment he just stared, the calculation in his eyes dissolving into something hungrier. "Ivy," he breathed. "You look like you were built to end empires." He produced a velvet box from his jacket. Inside sat a Delacroix necklace. Emeralds circled in diamonds. Heavy enough that I felt the weight of it settle across my collarbone. The second he clasped it there. "Ready to ruin a wedding," he murmured against my ear. "Let's burn it to the ground." The drive to Ravenswood Estate, tucked into the Hudson Valley Hills, took 100 minutes. The place looked like something imported from a European fairy tale. All turrets and manicured hedges, exactly the kind of pretentious, oversized venue Paige had been obsessing over on her mood boards for a year. We arrived as cocktail hour was folding into the reception. I'd deliberately skipped the ceremony. I wasn't there for vows. I was there for the entrance. Damien took my hand at the base of the stone steps. "Head up." "Ivy, you don't walk into rooms. Rooms rearrange themselves around you." The massive doors to the ballroom stood closed. A string quartet, audible from inside, along with my father's booming laugh. Damien looked at the coordinators, flanking the entrance. They took one glance at his face and yanked the doors open without a word. The music didn't stop right away. The conversation did. It rolled backward through the room like a wave, table by table, until 240 guests sat in dead silence. I stepped into the chandelier light. Emerald silk shimmering, the Delacroix diamonds catching every source of it. I didn't shrink. I didn't apologize for the space I took up. I walked like I owned the floor beneath my heels. The whispers started immediately. "Not about me. Is that... Oh my God. That's Volkov. What is Damien Volkov doing here?" Every step across that ballroom floor felt like it took an hour and a heartbeat at the same time. I could feel 240 pairs of eyes tracking the emerald silk, the diamonds, the unmistakable weight of Damien Volkov's hand at my back. And for the first time, in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the old, familiar urge to apologize for being looked at. I felt powerful. I felt, for lack of a better word, correct. Like I had finally walked into the version of the room I was always supposed to occupy. I found the head table easily. Paige was drowning in a frothy designer gown that made her look smaller than she actually was. And her radiant bridal smile evaporated the moment her eyes found mine. Beside her, Grant froze mid-sip of champagne, his eyes dragging over the body he used to call a liability. And something like regret bled into his expression before he even registered who was standing beside me. When recognition hit, the color drained straight out of his face. As a lawyer who ran in the same financial circles as half the room, he knew exactly whose name belonged to that face. Damien led me straight down the center aisle, the crowd parting like the room itself was afraid of him. Senators who'd been laughing loudly a moment earlier suddenly found their napkins fascinating. We stopped directly in front of the head table. "Ivy," my mother hissed, rising halfway out of her chair, panic flattening her voice. "What is the meaning of this, you are not on the list?" Damien simply looked at her. Whatever he communicated with that single glance made her sit back down and close her mouth so fast I heard her teeth click. "We're here to offer our congratulations," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent room. He turned to Grant. "Grant, is it? I understand. You appreciate a good investment." Grant's throat worked visibly. "Mr. Volkov, I thank you for coming." Damien's hand settled possessively at the small of my back. "It's a shame," he said, smiling in a way that showed too many teeth to be friendly. "You had a sapphire, and you traded it for glass. A man with limited vision can only recognize so much value." Paige let out an outraged gasp. "Excuse me. Who exactly do you think you are?" "Paige." "Stop talking," Grant snapped. Gripping her wrist, Damien leaned down and pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to my bare shoulder, never once breaking eye contact with Grant. "Oh, we'll enjoy the reception," he said. "The night is only getting started." What followed was less a dinner and more a public demolition. Conducted with total calm, Damien never raised his voice once. Never made a single move that could be called a threat in front of witnesses. And yet by the time the salad plates were cleared, 3 separate guests had quietly excused themselves rather than risk being caught in his orbit. We took the seats that had belonged to my Uncle Marcus and Aunt Louise, who took one look at Sergei looming behind Damien's chair and relocated themselves near the kitchen doors without a word of protest. For the first time in over a year, I ate an entire plate of food in front of my family without a single comment about portions. I worked through a filet and truffle risotto with genuine, unhurried pleasure, while Damien occasionally slid a bite of his own lobster onto my plate, watching me with dark, fascinated approval. Across the room, Paige picked miserably at an undressed salad, glancing our way every few seconds. Grant, meanwhile, had abandoned champagne entirely and was working steadily through the reception's most expensive scotch. My father, who had spent my entire childhood loudly proud of Paige's trophies and quietly silent about my own accomplishments, kept sneaking glances at our table like he couldn't decide whether to be furious or impressed. At one point he leaned toward my mother and muttered something I couldn't hear, and she shushed him so fast, her napkin fell off her lap. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in years texted me under the table, "Is that seriously who I think it is sitting next to you?" I didn't answer. I was too busy enjoying my truffle risotto. A distant aunt, 3 glasses of wine deep, wandered over at one point to say hello, which really meant she wanted a closer look at Damien. She retreated within 30 seconds, visibly rattled, after he answered her question about how we'd met with a single unblinking sentence. Fate has a sense of humor. Halfway through the main course, I excused myself for air. The floral centerpieces were thick and cloying, and the sheer adrenaline of the evening had left me a little dizzy. I left Damien mid-conversation with a visibly terrified state assemblyman and made my way to the powder room down a hallway lined with antique mirrors. I was reapplying my lipstick when the door swung shut behind me with a heavy click. I turned. Grant stood there, tuxedo jacket abandoned, bow tie hanging loose, his face flushed with scotch and desperation. "Ivy," he said, stepping toward me. "You're in the wrong bathroom," I said, my voice flat, though boundaries never were your strength. "Don't do this." He reached for my hand. I pulled it back before he could touch me. "Paige means nothing to me. She was easy." "Ivy." She agreed with everything I said. "She's boring. She doesn't have your fire." The firm's senior partners made comments about optics, and I panicked. I thought I needed someone who photographed a certain way to make partner. "We can fix this. Leave the thug you came with. I'll have this annulled by morning. We'll go back to how it was." I actually laughed. A real, loud laugh that bounced off the marble. "You think I'd take you back after you slept with my sister for 10 months and told me my body embarrassed you at the holiday party, Grant. You're not a prize. You're a warning label." His face hardened, the desperate mask slipping to reveal the cold, calculating man I'd actually been engaged to. "You think you're safe with Volkov. He's using you. You think a man like that actually wants a woman built like you. You're a prop. Ivy, a joke he's playing on your family." "That's interesting," I said, coming from the man who spent 6 years telling me I should be grateful anyone wanted me at all. At least Damien's never once suggested I order the salad. This isn't a joke. "Ivy, I'm trying to warn you." "No," I said, stepping closer, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching me retreat. "You're trying to save face in front of the family you married into an hour ago. There's a difference. And for what it's worth, the version of you standing here right now, sweating through a $5,000 tuxedo and begging his ex-fiancé for a second chance on his own wedding night, is exactly the man I should have seen a long time ago, before I could throw the response sitting on my tongue. The door was kicked open so hard, the handle cracked against the wall. Damien stood in the doorway. He wasn't shouting. He looked, somehow, far more dangerous for his silence. Sergei slipped in behind him and locked the door. "I believe," Damien said, voice a soft, terrible rasp. I mentioned my distaste for bad manners earlier tonight. Grant backed into the sink. "Mr. Volkov." I was just... Damien crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbed the lapels of Grant's tuxedo, and slammed him against the antique mirror hard enough to spiderweb the glass behind his head. "You will speak to her with reverence," Damien said, his face inches from Grant's. "She is a queen. You are something that scurries under a floorboard. If you ever again suggest her body, her meat, or her presence is anything less than extraordinary, I will make sure you're identified by paperwork rather than a face. Nod, if that's clear." Grant nodded frantically, tears streaking down his face. Damien dropped him in a crumpled heap and straightened his own cuffs with unbothered calm before turning to offer me his arm. "Shall we? I believe it's time for toasts. I brought a gift for the happy couple." The ballroom was already thick with tension when we returned. The best man's toast had clearly been rattled by whatever look Damien had thrown him earlier. As the applause died, Damien rose, picked up his champagne flute, and tapped it once with a fork. The sound was quiet. The room went dead silent anyway. "A toast," he announced, leading me toward the dance floor. I kept my chin up, the emerald silk sweeping around my legs. Paige looked ready to faint. My mother had a fistful of her own pearls. Grant, freshly bruised and disheveled, hovered near his chair like he didn't trust his legs. "Weddings are a time for honesty," Damien said, pacing slowly, a merging of assets, a declaration of loyalty. "Grant, you spoke earlier about optics, about fitting a certain picture, but in my world, we have a very strict policy regarding theft." The word landed like a dropped chandelier. "What is he talking about?" Paige hissed at Grant. He didn't answer. His face had gone entirely bloodless. Damien nodded to Sergei, who tapped a tablet, and the projector screen moments earlier looping photos of Grant and Paige's engagement shoot flickered to a detailed financial ledger, fully visible to all 240 guests. "I'm a businessman," Damien said, "and my accountants recently uncovered some fascinating irregularities in a set of offshore accounts managed by a certain ambitious associate at Kessler and Wren." A collective gasp rolled through the crowd. Let's review the registry. Shall we? A polished infographic bloomed across the screen, laying out precisely how Grant had funded his lifestyle. When you diverted $11.4 million to cover your boat slip, your penthouse, and this frankly excessive wedding, Damien said, turning to Grant. You didn't only steal from your clients. You stole from a holding company that belongs to my family. Somewhere behind me I heard a socialite whisper, "Oh my God," under her breath, followed by the frantic click of at least 3 phones being pulled out of clutches and jacket pockets. Nobody in that room was going to forget this wedding for a very long time. And for once in my life, I didn't mind being the reason why. The silence that followed was absolute. "You told me you had family money," Paige shrieked, slapping Grant's chest. "You told me you were already rich. Paige, please. I did it for us. You did it because you're a hollow man who needs shiny things to distract from how empty you are," I said, my voice ringing clean across the ballroom. I looked at my sister's ruined mascara, my mother sobbing into a napkin, and felt something I hadn't expected. Nothing. No pity. Just freedom. Damien smiled at me like I was the only thing in the room worth looking at, then snapped his fingers. The heavy doors burst open a second time. Not more waitstaff, but 6 agents in Navy windbreakers, badges out, flanked by financial crimes investigators, Grant, St. Clair. The lead agent barked, "You're under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny." Chaos erupted. Paige screamed as agents pushed past the cake table. Grant tried to bolt and knocked over a tower of champagne glasses before Sergei calmly tripped him, sending him sprawling at the agent's feet. They hauled him up and cuffed him in front of 240 of the city's most influential guests as Grant was marched down the aisle of his own wedding, sobbing for a lawyer. Damien turned his back on the wreckage and looked down at me, the hard edges in his eyes finally softening. "I promised you a night to remember," he murmured, tracing my jaw. Did I deliver? I looked at the ruined reception. The arrested groom, my humiliated sister, a room full of people who'd spend the next decade gossiping about this exact moment. Then I looked at the terrifyingly gorgeous man who'd spent the entire evening treating my body like it was the most valuable thing in the building. "You delivered," I whispered, and wrapped my arms around his neck. Right there, surrounded by flashing badges and the sound of my family's world collapsing, Damien Volkov kissed me, like the night was just beginning. We skipped the cake entirely, hunt in hunt. We walked out of Ravenswood Estate and into the back of his idling Bentley, leaving every ounce of my old life in the wreckage behind us. The story, of course, did not stay contained inside those castle walls. By Monday morning, half of New York's financial and legal circles were quietly buzzing about the associate who'd been arrested at his own wedding for embezzling from a shipping magnate's holding company. Kessler and Wren issued a stiff, carefully worded statement distancing themselves from Grant within 48 hours. And 2 of the firm's senior partners resigned amid questions about oversight. Paige deleted her wellness page entirely after screenshots of the ballroom chaos went viral under captions that were, frankly, far crueler than anything I would have written myself. He felt, to my own surprise, a flicker of something close to sympathy for her. She had, after all, only ever wanted to be seen as the golden one. And instead, she'd become a cautionary headline. My mother called 4 times over the following week. I let 3 go to voicemail. On the 4th, I finally answered. Mostly. Out of curiosity. Ivy, she said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. Your father and we didn't know about the money. We just wanted you both settled. You wanted Paige settled. I said, not unkindly. Just honestly. I was supposed to disappear quietly and be happy for her. I'm not angry anymore. Mom. But I'm also not going back to being the daughter who apologizes for existing so everyone else can be comfortable. She didn't have a response to that. And for the first time in my life, her silence didn't feel like something I needed to fill. Grant's case moved through the federal system over the following months. A plea deal. Restitution orders. A sentence that would keep him well occupied for the foreseeable future. I didn't attend a single hearing. I heard about the outcome the same way everyone else did. Through a headline Naomi forwarded me with a single laughing emoji attached. As for Damien and me, what started as an outrageous, reckless proposition in a hotel bar somehow became the steadiest, most honest relationship I'd ever had. He never once asked me to be smaller, quieter, or less than exactly who I was. If anything, he seemed constitutionally incapable of tolerating anyone who tried to make me feel otherwise. 6 months after that wedding, we were still together. And I had stopped waiting for the version of myself that fit someone else's picture. I had simply become the whole picture myself. Looking back now, I don't think of that night as revenge at all. Not really. Revenge implies I did something to Grant and Paige that they didn't already do to themselves. All I did was stop shrinking long enough for everyone in that room to see exactly who they'd been dealing with all along, and let the truth do the rest of the work for me. So, did Ivy's revenge give you chills? Or was Damien's wedding gift the biggest twist you've seen all week? If you loved watching this arrogant ex get exactly what he deserved, smash that like button and send this to anyone who needs a reminder that they never have to shrink themselves for people who never deserved them in the first place. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more dark, twisted revenge stories. What would you have done in Ivy's position? Tell me below.